everyone, I'm Kenia Reyes, and we are getting to know more of our Bible characters that you will be able to find in Heroes 2. And I know so many of you are so excited, so let's jump right in. Joining us today, we have Pastor Andrea. Hi, how are you today?
Hi, I'm doing well.
Awesome. We are so happy that you took this time to join us today. And we are very excited to get to know our next Bible characters. Now, we know our Bible characters, and especially these Bible characters, right? We think we know them. We think we have it all figured out. We've heard about them all our lives. But today we want to dive a little bit deeper. And so today we're going to be discussing Adam and Eve, right? And so I think that we have a few questions here that maybe you can help us so that we can understand more of their story. Right now, all that we pretty much know, at least, about Adam and Eve is that they were the first humans and they were the first people who were created by God. And we know that they were in the Garden of Eden. But we know that sadly, because they ate a fruit of a tree, they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And we know that they had children. Two of them in particular are super famous, Cain and Abel. But after that, we don't know any further deeper details other than what we can find in those first few chapters of Genesis. So we have a few questions and we're hoping that you can give us some deeper insight, okay?
Okay.
Awesome. So the first question that we have for you is, why do we like these characters so much? I think we do have sometimes these different feelings about these characters. We might say, but what happened? Why would you do that? Why would you fall? But then at the same time, we do have a very warm place for them because they're the first characters basically we're introduced to.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Kenya. We have these, I don't know if you could call it a love and hate relationship with that, because maybe it's not necessarily hate I don't think, but it's definitely a sadness, maybe. Just, with the fact that they did this, they chose sin, they didn't choose God, they chose Satan's side. And there are so many lessons really that can be found within just this one story. And I love digging deeper into what they did and the conversation between Satan and Eve, and then, what happens afterwards, just because there's so much that we can learn from them. And I think it just kind of illustrates as you go through it that we are just like them. We can say that, well, I would never do what they did, but really, because we all still struggle with sin. We still do things that sometimes we don't want to do. Maybe a lot of times we do things that we don't really want to do. So I think that they are just real characters. And then I also like even later on when they have kids, again, it just shows that they are like us. They had to struggle through pain. Because like you said, Cain and Abel, their first two sons, so well known because of what happened. Because the first thing that happens is a murder right after they fall. And it's their own kids, who are doing that. And so they went through a lot. So I think there is just a humanness to them that in a way is kind of like, we resonate with it. We know that, yes, we all have a problem with some of these things that are mentioned in their story.
Definitely. I think you bring up an excellent point that many of us might not consider, and it's that we should be a little bit more sympathetic. Sometimes we might be a little bit too harsh, I think, when we think about Adam and Eve, especially Eve. We've always heard maybe the comment of someone saying, like, I want to get to heaven and I want to see Eve and I'm going to have like a strong conversation. But I think that, like you said, there is a human aspect that we need to also consider in their lives, which actually brings me to my next question. We talk about the fall and we talk about their mistakes, but they are in Heroes too. And why should we consider them heroes?
That is a good question. And I don't know if I necessarily have a right answer, but I think that they are heroes, and maybe especially because of what God did when he reacts to what it is that they have done, right? So again, it's not necessarily about them. It's God who makes them heroes
Mm,
because of just his reaction to sin. Because he could have just said, well, I mean, that's it. I don't want to have anything to do with you. And he doesn't, because he's pursuing them. And so just the question when he comes after them, and the first thing he asks them is, where are you? It's because he's a God who loves them and who's just coming after them because he wants to have that relationship with them, even though they just rejected him in a way by choosing what they chose. He still keeps coming after them. And I think that's what makes them heroes. It's not necessarily who they are and what they have chosen, but what God did for them, and the fact that then they realize what they have done, and they continue to live and walk with God, even though imperfectly, even after that.
I think it's that's such a beautiful sentiment that you just expressed, and it's perfect, I think, for all of the heroes that we can find in Heroes too. That it isn't necessarily what they did that made them heroes, but it was what God did, and for many of them, what God did through them and with them, right? And what a beautiful reminder for all of us as we play Heroes, as we're behind on our phones and we're playing these games, to remember that also in our lives, it's not about what we could possibly achieve, but what he achieves through us, right? And so now you did mention their humanness and the things that they obviously, we know that they struggled with and that led ultimately to the fall. But what are possibly some other struggles that we might not consider or that we might not think of when we think of Adam and Eve?
Well, just from the story of, like, kind of Abel and Cain, what happens later, I think that there is something that maybe we don't really think too much about, the pain that would have caused, to see them. And really, I have my Bible here with me, but like, I think of, like, right in chapter 4, right at the beginning, it says, so Adam knew his wife, and then it says that she bore Cain. And the first thing she says is, she says, I have acquired a man from the Lord. But the translation there can also say, I have acquired a man, the Lord, because she had just been given the promise of the
Mm,
Messiah, and now they have a son. And so she thinks that this is the Messiah.
mm,
And then what happens is the complete opposite. Not only is he not the Messiah, he's the first murderer.
mm.
He's the one who takes the first life. And so it just makes me think of, I think that we don't realize how much pain they would have gone through because of the choices they made. And I think that it kind of like just lived out, it just kept going as they saw the pain and the hurt in this world. I think it would have been even more palpable for them than it is for us.
Definitely. I think that sometimes we also, I think we get stuck on just the beginning acts, I guess, of their story. What happens in the Garden of Eden, what happens directly after, and then obviously the story of Cain and Abel. It's intense, and so we learn about that story, but we forget that there are other characters, kind of in the behind the scenes, Adam and Eve, and I never heard about the fact that Eve probably thought, like you said, Eve thought that this was the Messiah.
Mhm.
And to then see what ends up happening and how that hope kind of just vanishes right before her eyes, that must have been so difficult. And I think that a lot of us can resonate with those difficulties of maybe having a hope that something is something, and then it ends up being the total opposite.
The expectations that get shattered, right, in our lives.
Oh, that must be so, especially knowing what had just happened. Your expectations are really high, right? You just got this promise and you're like, oh, all is not lost. It's all going to get better. And then it doesn't. So
Yeah.
that's something that we all struggle with. Now, you
And
mentioned, yeah,
sorry, I'm just jumping in real
of
quick,
course.
but that's the reality of sin, right? Because
Yeah.
once sin enters the world, that is what happens. And
Mhm.
it's irreversible because that it causes that destruction. And so it just kind of just keeps spiraling, and you see it from the start. But that's also
Definitely.
where you can see the hope that God brings them, of telling them there is a Messiah who's going to die for them, is so beautiful. And that is the one thing that I'm sure they just held on through their whole lives.
You mentioned that, and that's actually a perfect segue into the next question that we have here. And it's, what was their relationship with God like? You mentioned how after they make this mistake, God calls out to them, and then how he gives them a promise, a hope to hold on to. And he didn't completely just leave them out in the wilderness to die. So, what is it that we can learn from that relationship that they had with God?
I love that question. So I think that there is just so much that, like, especially in the conversation with Eve and the serpent, that we can learn about
Mhm.
that, where she herself, she's doubting God. She
Mhm.
is first. Satan kind of starts talking about God, and he calls God Elohim,
Mm.
which is a name for God, but it's a name for God that means God who's powerful and who's transcendent, who's kind of like far away. And
Mm.
it's an important picture of who God is. But then there is another name that is used in the scriptures, and that's the term Yahweh, which is a personal God who you have a
Mm.
close relationship with. So this is like if you were saying Yahweh, you're saying this is my God, right? My God who I love, who I'm walking with. And Satan tries to trick her into thinking that God is only this transcendent God, this powerful God who doesn't really care about her, who's not really there. And she falls for it. And she starts calling God by the same name, by Elohim also,
Oh.
and not Yahweh. And so you see that even at the beginning, I mean, she's just doubting, right? She has questions about God. And I think
Mm.
that we definitely can fall into that. She starts, Satan is trying to make her think that God is a tyrant, that evil is relative, that um, God only wants something for himself, because as she says, oh yes, when she sees this was good for food and pleasant to the eyes and to make someone wise. Well, God wants to be wise, but just only he wants to keep it for himself. Just kind of forgetting the fact that God had given them everything in the garden, right? They already
Mm.
had everything they could have wanted. But she thought maybe there was the possibility of something more. And I think that that is a really important lesson in her story, because we
Hmm.
all fall into that too, where we start doubting God or questioning, and then just thinking, well, maybe I know better. And she ultimately just kind of goes based on her own intuition, right? And so you see that like breaking down of relationship with God, because that's what sin does. So when we start pondering it and we really get into like, living our lives in just the way that I wanted, we see things only through a certain perspective, like my own. And that this is so interesting, where she says she looks at the tree and she said, she saw that tree was good for food.
Mm.
Before that, the only thing that was called good was by God, because
Mm.
after every day he
Mhm.
creates something, right? He says it was good, and then when he creates humans, he says it's very good. And so now suddenly she is the first one that's also mentioned as calling something good, but it is not something good. So it's like the complete opposite, because she has her own vision of what it is and what she sees.
Hmm.
And it's a limited perspective, right? She can only
Yeah.
see that. And yet she thinks it's good when it isn't. And so I think it's just this, their relationship is it's this caution of trusting God fully. And that is where they have a problem, because they choose to trust someone else rather than God. Um, so yeah, that's really, what I see that their struggle was, to fully just trust God. And I think that we have that too, a lot, because
Mm.
we oftentimes fall into, I will trust myself, or what other people think or say, instead of that. And I even find that interesting in the scripture, where it says, they hear the sound of God walking in the garden after they
Mhm.
sin. Well, the word for hear can also be translated as obey. But it's so interesting, because they did the opposite. They heard God, but they didn't actually obey, right? So
Mm.
hearing does, that relationship with God means that I hear, that I obey, that I live and walk with him. And so it's this cautionary tale of, their lives, of things that we also need to pay attention to. And then it's that just beautiful reminder of the fact that even though they did that, God's grace shows through and, and comes back. And I think that's really the most important thing about that relationship, that, God is the one who constantly keeps pursuing us and coming after,
Mhm.
and they responded to it. And that's the beautiful thing.
I think that what you just said basically answers and encompasses also my very last question, about how we can apply this to our lives. And I like how you mentioned, that it's a cautionary tale, that it should serve as a cautionary tale, but we should never see it as something that, like, oh, Adam and Eve made a mistake. They did that. How could they? When perhaps we're falling into the same traps of calling something good when it really is the total opposite. So, to everyone who's watching, everyone who might have said, well, I know the Adam and Eve story, I know everything that there is to know, what would you tell them that is something that they can learn from this story and should not be ignored?
So probably I just keep coming back to the most important thing that's in the story, and that is the promise of the Messiah that,
Mhm.
that is given to them. Like, even afterwards, after they sin, God says, okay, these are the judgments on the serpent. And then he speaks to the woman and the man, but really he's just kind of telling them the consequences of sin. This is what's going to happen. But in the midst of all of that, at the end of this conversation, with of the things that he tells Satan, he says, but there will be that seed, that is coming, that will crush your head and you will bruise his heel, which is really talking about the fact that Satan will be crushed by Jesus on the cross. And
Mhm.
so to me, that is, it's just such a beautiful promise that God gives them, even though they, cause all of this because they fall
Mhm.
because of what Satan has told them. God comes back and promises them the Messiah, who is the hope of our world. And that is still something that we can all hold on to. And I believe they held on to it from that point on as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that everything that you've just shared with us, all of these insights, that although we know these stories very well, and although we think we know every detail, and we might hold, like what you said, it's a love and hate relationship with these
Mhm.
characters, for all of our viewers and friends who are going to be playing Heroes 2, I think they might reconsider choosing Adam and Eve as their character, because maybe we weren't thinking about it. At least I wasn't thinking about it. But maybe now, if anything, choosing Adam and Eve is choosing people that are just like me and just like everyone watching. That yes, we are sinners. Yes, we have fallen. But we have never fallen so far that we cannot be saved by his grace. And we still have hope. So thank you so much for all the insight that you brought. I know that we have a lot of notes that we can take about all the wonderful things that we learned today. We are so happy that you joined us today, Pastor Andrea. And thank you so much for everything you shared.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
Excellent. Now, we just want to say to all of our viewers, make sure that you continue coming back all month long. We're going to be sharing even more stories about our Bible characters, and we will be going deeper into their lives as we get ready and we get excited for Heroes 2.